Good morning. I'm Richard Jaenicke from Green Hill Software. I'm the Director of Marketing for the safety critical and the security critical products, including our Integrity 178 operating system. And I'm here today to talk to you about satellite security. In the last talk, Devin did an excellent job of talking about edge computing and why you might need it when the network is unreliable. Satellites are obviously a big part of our networking today, and I'd like to explain to you how we can maybe make sure that those are more reliable. You're a smart bunch of people, so I thought I'd start with a survey. You guys know something about satellites. So answer this question, or I want to see a show of hands. Who thinks that satellites today are sort of resistant to hacking because they're so old? They're mostly hardware, ASICs, and who can hack that stuff? Okay, you have to vote. Raise your hand if it is a yes, down is a no, and halfway up is a maybe? Yeah? Okay. How about GPS? Hey, those are nice things to have. We use it for navigating, but it's not that important. After all, we survived without it before. We just pull out our paper maps, or we can even just use Google Maps without the GPS portion of it. Not that important? Yeah? How about most data sent between satellites is secure because everybody uses encryption. And if a hacker gets inside of a satellite, then they can do whatever they want because there's not a lot of security inside between the portions of the satellite. Any ideas? Yeah? Okay. So we'll go through that and see what we can find out through the presentation. I'm not going to talk to you too much about GPS itself. It was an example, but one thing I'd like to point out is the graph in the upper right-hand side shows the number of satellites you can see from any point on the globe. In the early days of GPS, I think you remember that maybe you could only see 2 or 3 satellites. You were having trouble getting enough satellites to actually triangulate and get your position. Well, now in North America, you can see upwards of 30 satellites from any given point. And down in Southeast Asia, you can see upwards of 50 satellites from any point. So it's a completely different era. But seeing lots of satellites doesn't mean you have ultimate accuracy. There's a whole other set of satellites that are satellite-based augmentation systems that improve the accuracy and improve the reliability. GPS satellites only have a 99% availability requirement. That's not enough to fly a plane with. So the FAA puts up another set of satellites that improves that to 5 nines availability and improves the accuracy as well. And there's even commercial companies that are putting up these satellite augmentation systems. And GPS is much more than navigation. It's really a timing system that we depend upon for financial transactions, for controlling power grids, and for even internet communication. Beyond GPS, we have comms and weather and imaging satellites. The weather satellites, 90% of our weather information comes from satellites. And that has huge public health and safety implications. And some industries, such as agriculture, have grown very dependent upon satellites, not just the weather part, but the imaging. Everything they do, from how much fertilizer gets put down in this square inch versus that square inch of land, is controlled by the data from imaging satellites. So we really depend upon these satellites. But they are vulnerable. We have all sorts of parts of the system. We have not only the spacecraft themselves, but there's ground stations, the control centers, the user terminals, the links, and which parts are vulnerable? Well, pretty much all of them. We'll give you some examples in a minute, and we have to, there's special parts of each of these, and the satellite themselves are sort of the control and propulsion side of it. But there's also the payload. The GPS part, for example, is the payload in a satellite, and they're independently vulnerable. So how do you attack a satellite, and what do we have to protect against? Well, there's physical attacks. In 2007, China shot one of their weather satellites out of the sky just to show that it could be done. And it created 3,000 pieces of shrapnel flying around very fast, hitting anything that would come into that belt. The US followed suit a year later, shot out a defunct spy satellite, and then even India decided they should join the party. Beyond missiles, there's also satellites that go and work on other satellites. They're technically repair satellites, but if you can repair your own satellite, you can also disrepair one of your enemy's satellites. Then there's electromagnetic attacks, jamming, EM pulses, and then of course cyber attacks. And that's from the ground station. It could be from a fake ground station, spoofing, because today the price of a high quality satellite antenna has dropped down to a few $100s. So just about anybody can try and spoof a ground station and attack a satellite. There's also other satellites, because satellites talk to each other. And then there's the satellite attacking itself, I suppose. You can think of it if you have bad parts from your supply chain. Supply chain, everybody in this room understands the supply chain risks. So this isn't just theoretical. There's been satellite hacking going on for over 20 years. One of the earliest ones was when the Russians hacked into Goddard and controlled a ROSAT satellite X-ray telescope. They turned it towards the sun and blinded it. More recently, the Chinese in 2014 hacked a NOAA server and caused a 2-day outage of those weather satellites that we talked about that gave us 90% of our weather information. There's a lot more recently that isn't a lot public. So what do we do about it? Well, how do you respond to the physical attacks? We don't have armed satellites yet, but you can maneuver the satellite out of the way if you have enough time and enough fuel. For EM, there's anti-jamming and EM hardening that's been done for a while. It's really cyber's the big frontier. One of the most important things you need to do is have some real-time anomaly detection. But in general, you should just apply general InfoSec guidance, have authentication, access control, encryption, etc. In the end, it still seems like it's too hard. You can't really ensure the survivability of a satellite with all these different attack vectors. The answer instead is to make your satellite system resilient. So resilience versus survive. Resilience is the ability to have degraded systems, some system malfunction, some parts not working, and still provide service, possibly in a degraded manner. And how do you achieve that? Well, it's through the principles of disaggregation, distribution or proliferation, diversification, and protection. So some examples are, today we build these big satellites with lots of sensors on them. If you just break it into smaller satellites each with a few sensors, then that's disaggregation. And that way, if you take one satellite out, you still have the other ones. Similarly, proliferation is with our GPS constellation. There's lots of satellites in the constellation. You take one out, you have other ones that are doing the same job to back you up. Diversification takes that one step further. If somebody is able to bring down GPS system as a whole, if you can also talk to the European version, Galileo, then you're still in business. Or there's something called HAPS, high altitude platforms, systems that are aerial ships that you can launch, high altitude airships that you can launch up and provide a GPS service. Then the protection is more of the standard stuff, the anti-jamming and encryption. So what kind of trends do we see because of this? Well, on the left is an 18,000 pound satellite with lots and lots of sensors on it. But instead of these large multifunction satellites, we're going to have smaller satellites. Pictured here is a CubeSat being launched from a launcher on the International Space Station. That's 3 pounds. Really big difference. So you'd have lots of little ones deployed in clusters or constellations. And instead of proprietary architectures, you'd use more open architectures and enable rapid technology insertion. Instead of taking a long time to design the ultimate hardened, long lifespan satellite, you do shorter lifespans and more frequent launches. Maybe the ability to launch something quickly. If something goes down, you just launch another one. And instead of designing for safety and survivability, now you design for security and resilience, and with needing to detect cyber intrusions and isolate any intrusion that you have. So what are the implications for this industry, for the embedded industry? Well, smaller satellites mean reduced size, weight, and power. We're all into that. That has implications on the applications too, because you're probably going to have less memory. You're going to need to run multiple functions per processor. That has implications on what the security architecture is. If you have a shorter lifespan, hey, it better cost less. You use COTS hardware and software to get there. That brings on some supply chain risks that you have to deal with. With a higher number satellites that cost less, but there's a trade-off, you can actually distribute NRE over a larger number of satellites. So that provides some opportunities. Rapid technology insertion implies modular open systems architectures in general, and that goes so far as to include the security architecture. And you do need that security architecture. You can't get a waiver. You can't punt on the security requirements anymore. So what are the different layers for the satellite, for security in a satellite? Well, it starts on the inside. Inside the processor, you need to have isolation and separation of the application so that no matter if you get a rogue application that somebody didn't test or somebody hacks into an application, it's isolated. It only affects that one application. You can't affect all the other operations of the system. Then you need the access control to make sure that nobody can go and change that, and the authentication to tell who can have access control, and intrusion detection to protect the perimeter of your system, and the data encryption to protect the data going in and out of the system. And this isn't just the satellite itself, this is each individual component of that overall satellite system we saw, the ground station, the control centers, the satellites, even the user terminals. And here's where Green Hills can help. The Integrity 178 separation kernel provides the isolation and the access control. And it's not just designed and should be able to do it. It's actually the only COTS operating system certified to the NSA's separation kernel protection profile. And it's been tested by the NSA to make sure that it actually complies with all of this. Now, let's take an example of a recent satellite that's tried to apply most of these techniques. It's the new GPS-3 satellite. There's a few of them in orbit now. There's more being built and launched as we speak. In this particular generation, they've managed to make the mission data unit 70% digital, meaning software-based. In the next build, they're going to make it 100% digital. It has the normal getting everything better of being 3 times more accurate, but on the protection side, it's also 8 times better anti-jamming. It already has the proliferation, lots of satellites in the constellation, but they've also added diversification. The compatibility with all L1C type global navigation systems so that the same satellite receiver can receive Galileo or GPS signals and from any other country that's on the L1C system. And being designed to evolve to incorporate new technology and mission changes was an explicit requirement for this, and they have achieved it. Oh, and there happens to be a really nice separation kernel on that satellite. So let's go back to the audience survey. So do we know all the answers now? Are satellites harder to hack when they're hardware-based? No, the older satellites really didn't have much security. It was very easy to hack them. Can we make do without GPS just by pulling out our old paper maps? Not really. Our financial system would crumble, our power grids would fail, and our agricultural system would fall into disarray. Is data sent to and from satellites encrypted? Yeah, it actually is. I forgot to touch on that. It turns out that most satellites didn't encrypt until about 10 years ago, but most satellites in operation today are less than 10 years old. So most of the satellite data is encrypted. And if a hacker can get into a satellite, can they have free reign inside? And the answer is absolutely, unless you have an NSA level separation kernel, like Integrity 178.